Hello, everyone. I'm Vince White. I'm an employment attorney, and talking about your rights today. What if someone was to ask me, what is the most understood right a U.S. citizen has? I would probably have to say the freedom of speech, which might surprise you because that's like the one everybody talks about, the one that people think is not in question, right? Like right to bear arms. There's a whole fight about that going on right now. Freedom of religion. Well, we got some weird ideas about that. But freedom of speech, everybody thinks that's like this unassailable right that everybody agrees on. And it probably is, but people don't really understand what it means, right? I get a lot of calls. Oh, my employer won't let me. Try to think of some crazy post giant Sonic the Hedgehog on the bulletin board at work. Okay, it's my freedom of speech. They're stopping my freedom of speech, my freedom of expression. They can't do that. Well, is your employer the government? Because freedom of speech applies to the government stopping you, a citizen, in your expression, right? Not your private employer. That's just not how that works. People are like stunned by that constantly. But those are rights against the government. They, they protect you from the government's actions, right? Which is something that like we also don't really understand anymore. That people for all of time were terrified of their government, and now we're like, give the government all the power. It doesn't make any sense. But freedom of speech was a right. It was a protection against government, right? So your private employer doesn't have the same constraints necessarily. And the National Labor Relations Board reminded us of this pretty recently. They had a case that was filed. I'll go through just a quick paraphrase summary. Fellow was working at a job. Job had nothing to do with anything. Just a job where he earned his living. And when he was in his off hours, he was going to community meetings in the community where he lived, and he was advocating for police reform. Right? There's some real issues in the United States with police violence towards, frankly, African Americans right now. And he felt very strongly about that, so he was going to these community meetings and he was advocating for police reform in his community. And his job said, "Nah, we don't like that. You're done." Wasn't working for the government though, so his job fired him. He ran to the National Labor Relations Board and filed a claim saying, "Oh, they fired me for expressing myself in political and social activism." And I'm paraphrasing heavily, so don't hold the NLRB to what I'm saying. But NLRB said, "Yep, they sure did. Fired you for social activism. Case dismissed." Because he wasn't working for the government. He doesn't have that freedom of speech. And you don't have that many protections in a private job site. It just isn't really there. So, listen, I would have made the argument that there's a racial component to what that gentleman was doing, and that he was opposing racial discrimination, and I would have probably filed that case with the EEOC or, depending on the jurisdiction, with a local state court, under the argument that he was opposing racial discrimination, and so this termination was retaliation. Would that work? I think so. Judges and defense attorneys might not agree, but I think it should work. But that's different. That's a different story than, it's a different argument than, I was engaged in social activism, I can't be fired for this. Well, that's too simple, and yeah, you probably can be fired for that, and the National Labor Relations Board recently decided you could. So keep your head in a swivel out there. Be aware of your situation. Situational awareness, right? What is your employer like? What are they up to? What might they do to you? Because obviously I want you to be free to engage in your social activism, but I also want you to be employed, right? To have a livelihood. So we have to think ahead, plan, be aware, be ready, and I wish you all good luck.